So welcome. This is Gary Kokens. I'm been the traditional moderator for the Society of Cost Engineer webinars. Let me introduce Doug. I'm going to actually read his bio. Then I'm going to hand it off to Jerry Collins, who's the founder, executive director, president, CEO of Society of Cost Engineers. Chat a little bit about it. Then we'll hand off to Doug. So Doug Howarth discovered hypereconomics, which is the study of market actions across four or more dimensions. Hypernomics reveals the linked, opposing, non-physical forces known as the law of demand, law of value and demand, which replaces the law of supply and demand, which we're all familiar with. Hypernomics discovers that buyers collectively form discernible patterns that may be statistically quantified and move over time. Analysis of those movements permits users to predict market responses with greater accuracy, find open market spaces, and improve profitability. Doug has 13 published papers across 4 continents and has been awarded for them 3 times. His company, Hypernomics, Inc., founded on his ideas, has worked for NASA, Virgin Galactic, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon Technologies, and Northrop Grumman. The U.S. Patent Office issued one of his patents to him and 2 others in his company for the world's first 4D market analytics software. He has addressed the Royal Aeronautical Society and NASA 3 times. And recently, go to Wiley.com. I'm also a book author with Wiley. His new book that has just been published is titled Hypernomics, Using Hidden Dimensions to Solve Unseen Problems. So, Jerry, a little bit of a description of Society of Cost Engineers and then hand it off to Doug.
Sure. Thanks, Gary. So the Society of Cost Engineers was formed a few years back as a vehicle to promote the discipline of cost engineering and give cost engineers a chance to share lessons learned and stuff back and forth with each other. And we are attempting to put out a webinar that we think is beneficial to the cost engineers, and very, very much appreciate Doug giving today's webinar. With that, Doug, show us what you got.
All right, very good. Well, thank you everybody for coming, and let me tell you a little bit about what Hypernomics is and what it can do for you. So, Hypernomics. So it's a new field of study. Coming from the prefix hyper and the suffix nonomy. So hyper means existing in more than 3 dimensions. Nonomy refers to a system of laws governing a body of knowledge. So when you combine them together, you get hypernomics, which is the study of forces in 4 or more dimensions. And so that's what we're going to be talking about here. So what can it do for you? Well, Hypernomics looks at the opposing forces of cost, value, and demand and tries to work out profits. So it can work out the best deals. If you're buying something, we're going to see that here. We can work out the best prices and sales potential, the market limits, which we're going to look at presently. And then if you're putting a new product into the market, it can work out the best features for you. So you might say, well, how does that work in practice? Well, we like to, in Hypernomics, make analogies to both geographical and biological systems. And so we've noticed that in the real world, what you can't see can hurt you. So a little over 300 years ago, Sir Admiral Cloudesley Shovel took his fleet from the Mediterranean and was attempting to sail into the English Channel at night. Now, he thought he was where this filled in circle is here, but his actual position was here. And so as he attempted to sail through the channel, he ended up on these Isles of Scilly here, and he crashed, and he and 14 to 1,800 people with him died. And so we're going to make the observation that physical limits, like a shoreline, are very similar to what you see in the marketplace. So this guy set sail at night in a storm on a guess, and he died from that. What Hypernomics finds is that markets act collectively. They form these demand limits, and buyers form what we could call a huddle, and that we can map. And they have minimum and maximum responses, and the maximum response is going to be especially critical. We're going to see that next, actually. Then there's this opposing force called value. So buyers flock, and we're going to see, just like birds flock with, a latitude, a longitude, and altitude. Turns out that buyers do the same thing in markets if you plot them in a certain way, or we're going to see that the buyers all collectively, within statistical parameters, they value the features the same way. And we're going to examine some of those forces today. Example one is we're going to look at business jet demand analysis and something that we could call the virtual shoreline, to get back into the idea of a physical limit here. So suppose you're considering building a business jet. This is actually a jet that was up for sale, called the Ariane AS2. It was backed by one of the wealthiest people in the world, Robert Bass, out of Fort Worth, Texas, part of the Bass brothers. And he determined that the value of the speed was very high, and that he and his group were going to go ahead and build this supersonic business jet. Now, it was going to go pretty fast. It only carried a few people. He had a development cost, and we want to figure out, what are the chances that this is going to be viable before it happens? Is what you ideally want to do, is see if this is viable before it launches. So we're going to ask ourselves, can this product work? The first thing you might want to do, they posted the development cost there for the vehicle, and you might want to go out, as we've done here, and pull up a bunch of aircraft models that have actually been developed, and you take their empty weight, as shown here. And if you do that, and you plot those points, as shown here, you get a pretty well correlated line that says that there's a certain trend here in the data, and the AS2 is over that trend. In fact, it's 62% over this development cost curve. Now, of course, it's going faster, so you might want to take into account the added complexity of speed. So if you go off to RAND, that's in caps, that's a quasi-government agency that the government formed some years ago. You go off to RAND, they have what they call the RAND cost model, and the RAND cost model gives you exponents for the various features that go into a plane, including the speed. And so there's a series of adjustment factors you can have that say, how much will the added speed cost me? And you see that we're showing 62% over the cost curve here. So most of these parameters are below 60%, with the exception of design support and flight tests. I know from being in the cost community for quite some time that these two are less than half of the total cost. So we might make the conclusion that this cost estimate looks okay. They might be able to do this for $4 billion. So as I've told you before, we look at cost, value, and demand. So we might want to say, well, what's the value? And now value in our vernacular is equivalent to the sustainable price, and the price is based on features. And so in order to see what the sustainable price of this vehicle is, what we want to do is see what the sustainable price of other like models has been in the data. And so we created a database here. We pulled in 115 models here, and we've got these various attributes that we're going to look at here. So this is what we call our template. This is a template that we built in Excel that we use to condition the data to go into our software that we originally called Me4D. We're going to rebrand that, Our company name has changed from Me to Hypernomics, but right now it's still called, this is software's Me4D. So we load that template into our software here. And so this software goes into the database tab. So it's the same data. And then down here in the lower portion here, we're going to make a couple of filters on the data. We're going to look for planes that are built from the beginning of 09 to the end of 18. That's a 10-year span. And we want them to be greater than 0. This company said they wanted to build 300 to 500 vehicles, 300 to 500 vehicles total, 300 in a decade and 500 overall. So we want to see if they can make 300 in a 10-year program, in a 10-year period. And to make it even more appealing to just to neck it down just to business jets, what we're going to do here is we're going to exclude turboprops. We have a column that says it's either a jet or a turboprop. We're going to exclude them. So now we're going to use 75 of our 115 data points and see what the market says the value of a product is here. There's a scatter plot feature in our software here that compares data in a crosswise fashion in a scatter plot here. And so what we're interested in is the list price here, 2019 $M. So we want to predict that price. And so down the diagonal, this is giving you a histogram of how the data separates by group. So you can see here, there's a lot of money, a lot of models that are inexpensive, and then there's a few models that are more expensive. So here, this is speed. This is passenger capacity, and this is the cabin height. You see there's some upward trends here. So it looks like the data might correlate pretty well with price, some of the stuff. And so the model tab then in the software compares dependencies. So we're going to try to predict the price in 2019. And what we do is the software gives the rank ordering of the independent variables here, positive and negative, relative to the dependent variable here to make it easier for you to make some selections. And so when we do that, when we try to build an equation, we use the model tab here, and we've actually selected variables here, 3 variables: volume per passenger, and max speed. And we have ourselves an adjustment factor that we've used here. This is the ping factor. Dr. Hu Shu Ping, about a dozen years ago in another society, wrote a paper entitled the ping factor, and she figured out that the constant in power form equations, as it comes out of Excel and many other programs, has a downward bias, and she's corrected for it here with the ping factor. So this is open source. We've added the ping factor in here. If you click this on and off, you'll see the equation goes up when the intercept goes up when you click the ping factor, and goes down when you turn it off. And then here's the 3 variable equation right here. Notice the speed is very important here, as they presumed at Ariane. And then here are the statistics for the equation, some of them. And then down here, this part of the software tells you if each independent variable is passing the p-test. And so we've set the p-values up here in the software. And this shows that it's all okay. Now originally when I thought that I would just flip back and forth between the program and this PowerPoint file, but we'll get into the program later. I actually have the program open with each one of these things, and then we'll show that. So we'll get through all the PowerPoint stuff, and then I'll show you how the program works interactively. And down here, we've got a residual table. You can either do it for unit space, or in here, they're standardized residuals. And this is showing the vehicles that are above and below the cost trend here. And then it lets you select individual residual information. So here I've just happened to pick one of the Bombardiers. It's pretty close to the line. And then it also has a full statistics report that comes out of it that you can click on, and you can export that to Excel. So the statistics are here and also here. So we've got some more stats here that show this is a pretty useful equation. And then we put them into what's known as the Analyze tab here. And the Analyze tab lets you take those 3 independent variables and dial in the value for any product that you want to put in here. So we're putting in the volume per passenger. Offline, we worked out the volume of the cabin, and it holds 8 to 12 people. So we've put in the volume and we divided it by 8. So here's the volume per passenger. Here's the number of passengers, and here's the speed. And it's in red because it's over here. It's past the threshold. So each one of these 3 charts here, you can right click on each one of these axis titles and swap the axis name out for any other. So this is showing you the volume per passenger relative to the price, the number of passengers relative to the price, and the max speed relative to the price. And this little red dot is known as the meatball. And this meatball's got the same height for each chart, even though the axis, the scaling could be a little different. And so what we see here is they wanted to sell this plane for $120 million. And this equation supports a price of greater than $150 million. So from this standpoint, the value prediction looks pretty good. But you might ask yourselves, well, what about the demand for this vehicle? Well, we have a demand tab that we've put together too. And what that does is you select a quantity variable, which here is the number that are built in this 10-year span between the beginning of 09 and the end of 18. And here's the value variable is the price. So each one of these dots represents a business jet in the database. And so what we've done here is we've created a series of bins, which are, in this case, equally sized. You could also do a Fibonacci series or a geometric series. So these bins are separating the data by price, 5 bins. We've got only 4 points here. Not every bin populates. And it's pretty well correlated. And then this green line here, this is a line that users actually discover by clicking the points to form the line of best fit along the outside boundary. And this is what's known as the demand frontier. And interestingly here, the slopes of the demand frontier and this aggregate market demand, so the green line and the red line, well, they're within 1% of each other. And we discover that happens in many mature markets. These slopes tend to approximate one another. We're going to have to ask ourselves, what does this demand frontier indicate about the Aerion's sales goals for the AS2? Remember, they wanted to sell 300 in the course of a decade. Well, back in 2018, an article came out in Forbes where the writer said that looks like there's a good chance that this engine will let the thing take flight. But then he says it's not clear what the market will support here at this price. But they go ahead to reaffirm that Aerion wants to sell 310 years and 500 total. And then they go on to state that several others are going to want to fill the same space. So we're going to ask ourselves the question here, is the market unclear? You made that statement. What makes you say that? And if it's unclear, or if it's clear, are the targets viable? And is it true a whole bunch of other firms are going to go after this space? Now, I think, as we know, there are some other firms that are going after that space right now. But we're going to ask ourselves, is the market unclear about what it can support? Well, let's look. But first of all, so here we've taken the data and we've gone back 5 years. So we're looking at the data from the beginning of 04 to the end of 13. And there was a demand frontier that formed here. And so here is the Arion price. And at that price, along that demand frontier, they could have built 47. Now, they started out with 20 orders in 2015. That's actually inside of the demand frontier, but recall their target is 300. So 5 years later, they still had the same 20 orders. Now, this line moved a little bit in their favor. It went from here to here. Previously, it would have supported 47 at 120. Of course, there's a air term around that. But now it supports 63, but still 63 is a long way from 300. In fact, the odds of making that are pretty thin. In fact, the odds of making that are less than 1 in 40. So in December 2020, I wrote that they had a slim chance of selling these 300 units because what Arion tried to do, much like the Admiral Clousley shovel, he tried to go into an area of the market that was, the market for him was open water. Shovel wanted to go into some open water that didn't exist. And Arion thinks they're moving into an open market space that somebody will support, and that's not the case. So before we see what happened here, let's just do a recount of where we are here. So 5 years into this program, the end of 19, what was the score? Well, Meatloaf here, pictured it right. Meat to his friends, Mr. Loaf to you and me. He wrote a song called 2 out of 3 Ain't Bad. That was part of the lyrics. So Arion got their cost right, and they got their value right, but they got their demand wrong, their sales limit. So they were 2 out of 3. And Meatloaf would say that ain't bad. So we're going to say, well, how did that work out for Arion? So what happened next? Well, this Arion VP, a guy I used to know, actually saw my post, got very ticked off, and basically said that they were on track. They'd made a huge sale. And what he didn't mention is the sale, such as it was, were all for options, and that wasn't money in the door. I said, good luck. And what happened next was they went bankrupt. Arion also stopped writing me. So what this proves here is 2 out of 3, cost, value, and demand. 2 out of 3 isn't good enough. May not be bad for Meatloaf, but it's not good enough for you and me. So the observation that comes out of this is that you don't tell the market how many it can buy, it'll tell you. So here's the 4D view of the market. And so this is what Hypernomics does. So we were looking at speed and volume per passenger driving price. So we got speed, volume per passenger. Speed is dimension 1, volume per passenger dimension 2. Supporting price, dimension 3, and over here is the quantity, dimension 4. And what does value have to do with demand? Well, every point on the left-hand value space, see these lines here, has a match on the right-hand demand plane. We call these point lines. They're basically conveying the fact that everything here is connected. These are parts of ordered quads where we've got value feature 1, value feature 2, price, and quantity. And you see the AS2 here is way outside of the existing pattern here. This is in linear space, so this is linear, 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 linear. And this is the view in log space. And so it's way out of bounds here. So that's our first example. Our example number 2 would be for air freight. We're going to look at the value of safety. So when it comes to an air freighter, you want a big air freighter, you want it to go fast. So the size and the speed might be attributes 1 and 2, and safety somewhere down the line. We're going to look at the value of that. And to be complete here, we're going to look at Eastern and Western Bloc countries. It turns out it's pretty hard to find the safety data for Eastern Bloc countries, but if you dig deeply enough, you can get some reasonable answers. We did. So we need to discover a database, which we've put up here. We're looking at 71 miles here. And the scatter plot here indicates that there are some relationships we want to look at. So what we're doing here, we want to predict the list price. And within the list price, there's a few relationships here. This is the loss rate. This is the volume in the cabin, or the payload bay rather. And this is the speed. So this is negatively correlated. The lower the loss rate, the higher the value. This is positively correlated. The higher the volume, the higher the price. And the speed is positively correlated. The higher the speed, the higher the price. So the loss rates, I found these especially useful and insightful. That's a Cessna cargo van, or the Cargo Master 208. This is often going into bush pilot areas, so they have the additional problem of flying into rugged terrain. But these are some of the Russian vehicles over here, and they don't do nearly as well as these are some of the better Boeing vehicles over here. And notice this is in log scaling, so this is compressing a lot of information here. So what could modeling these variables get us? Well, if we take the max payload, the max speed, and the loss rate, we get a nice 3-variable equation here. And it turns out the statistics for these, again, are pretty stellar. You can see we have some really good p-values here. And so if you drive yourself deep into the data, you discover that being, say, 10 times safer, suppose you had a loss rate of this is right in the middle of the data. There's a lot of planes that have a loss rate around here. And suppose you drove it to being 10 times safer. This is actually what some of the Boeing planes were achieving. Basically, by being 10, this is the trend line here. This is 2 sigmas up. This is 2 sigmas down. Basically, if you're twice as safe, you're going to add about another half again to the value. And so then you might say, well, how's the market reflect that? Well, the Russians have a plane that's in the database here, which is this Tupolev Tu-T04. And it's got pretty high passenger count and pretty high cruise speed. In fact, if you look at the Boeing Next Gen, so that's the 500, 600, 700, 800, 900 series. You see the Tupolev has more passenger capacity than the 737, slightly faster. The range is further, and it's got a lower list price and a discount price. But very interestingly, and this is our third order effect in full display here, the Tupolev has a loss rate, which I figured to be over 7. These are the number of hull losses per millions of flight hours. So this is an extraordinarily safe plane, but the Dash 500 is about 11 times safer than that, and the 800 is, approaching 40 times safer than this. So what's happened in the market there then is that this guy's only sold 89 units, and this guy sold over 7,000. They're still building these things along with the new 737. So this is why we want to get deep into the value of safety. Then we're going to have a third example here, the stock markets and the value of deep analysis. In this case, even deeper. So we just did a study with 3 independent variables. We're going to show you what happens if you get a little bit deeper than that. So the question is, how can you use this technique in the stock markets? And so we'll create a database. Now you could build this database any day of the year by yanking out, in this case, the S&P 500. What I've done here is I've created a few filters where we've taken variables such as return on assets and we set it greater than 0. So we're not using all the data points. We do this because we want to filter out terms that might throw off power form equations. So we're taking out the things that could be equal to 0 here. And we've got a pretty robust database here, as you can see, 411 data points. And so what does the scatter plot show us here? Well, again, we want to predict price. This is the last price here. There's a little histogram that shows you how the prices work. And there's some useful data in useful relationships to the data. As you can see here, looks like price falls with volume, but price goes up with earnings per share, goes up with book value, and it goes up with return on assets. And you see there's quite a bit of scatter in the data, which gets back to the whole point. Well, why are we using 5 variables? We're using 5 variables because no one variable is tightly correlated enough to give us a really good answer. We have to get deeper into the data. So what could a model produce for us out of that? And so here's an answer. Here's a 5 variable equation that looks at earnings per share, market cap, interestingly, the volume on a daily basis, return on assets, and the book value. Again, the residuals are down here. The variables are here. This equation won't ever correlate as well as something for the aircraft will, because there's so many factors involved, but it's still statistically viable. And you can look over here to see how the individual variables contribute to this. So the value goes down with volume, it goes up with earnings per share, it goes up with return on assets, although only slightly, as you can see there. And then you might ask yourself, well, does the stock market have a demand curve? And it turns out that it too has a demand curve. So here's the aggregate demand curve, this one in red, and then here in green is the demand frontier. Interestingly, there's not only an upward frontier here, but you see there's something like that we call a minimum demand curve that's forming down here. And very often in markets, there's an outer demand frontier that forms. This one's got enough information that might be viable here, but there's a inner frontier and an upper frontier, and sometimes an outer frontier. In this case, there's an inner frontier, which means that if your stock's good enough to get the S&P 500, this might be the minimum volume that you would see traded on a daily basis. So how would you use this information? Well, what we would like to do is we actually go back and go into this residual information here, which we can export, and then we would look for the stocks that seem to be undervalued, that are in play, that are not, for which people are not being sued, for example. So something is undervalued, but they have a huge suit on their table, and it looks like they're going to lose it. Maybe you don't invest in that. But if it's undervalued and it's okay, maybe you do invest in that. So you might say, well, how does that work out for us? So we just celebrated the 3.5-year anniversary of this fund that I put together. I call Hypernomics. So we're comparing our returns over the same period to the Wilshire 5000, the NASDAQ, the Dow Jones Industrial Average, Berkshire Hathaway here, and all the stocks in our fund come out of the S&P 500. So we take everything that we're betting on from here. We don't use any shorts, we don't use any options, and it's currently not open to the public.
Oh, hey, Doug, this is Jerry. Got a couple of
Yeah.
quick questions for you potentially.
Mhm.
So the examples you gave are very, very expensive um, units, if you will, planes and so on.
Uh-huh.
How
Except the
beneficial?
stocks.
Yeah, and that's nice. Well, so how beneficial would you say this would be to, appliances or toys or cars or,
Oh,
and how would a typical cost engineer potentially use something like this?
well, we have applied it to television sets. Interestingly enough, Terry, what we can do is we can work out one of the things that you can do in that stock market is every day the stock market has a daily volume and it's got a total number of shares outside. And it turns out that the volume, if you were to plot the slope of the volume, the demand for the volume and the total shares, that the volume is a proxy for the whole market. And so what you could do in a local Best Buy, you could go to a Best Buy and take the reviews out and plot the reviews against the prices and use the number of reviews as a proxy for the demand. And then you could figure out the response for the market to the price in a TV set, for example. So the TV sets, they go up by the number of lines of resolution from 720 to 1000 to 4000 to 8000. They go up with the screen size. They also go up. There's a step function for the refresh rate, which is now typically is now 60, but they also have 120s. And you could put a few other variables in there. So you could easily use this for appliances. In fact, we've done it for appliances.
Great. So, Doug, I have a question from Neil. It says
Yeah.
Hypernomics appears to be significantly data intensive. How does this
Yes.
tool work when exploring an innovative or revolutionary technology driven product that has limited historical data? Great question.
Oh, that is a great question. Yeah. Hi, Neil. That I like that question. Interestingly enough, if you were to look at, say, cell phones, you'd say, well, nobody ever built a cell phone before. So how am I going to be able to use your tool on cell phones? Well, we didn't have cell phones before they existed, but a few people had toyed with car phones before. There were actually mobile phones in cars. And before that, there were walkie-talkies. And before that, people were paying for communication, such as the watchtowers in ancient Europe. They had watchtowers that people paid for to get remote information about people that were approaching the castle. So what we would be able to do is we'd be able to quantify what people paid for walkie-talkies back in the day and figure out what they paid for the size and the range of that, and then figure out what people paid for the walkie-talkies, and then quantify what the value of the size was and the range, and then work out the value of the car phones that followed, and then make an extrapolation up to modern day cell phones.
Could you also use marketing survey data? I mean, if you had a large, and obviously I think that would be a little less accurate, but at least you would have a starting point, right? Could you, if you sampled, thousands of people and said, hey, how much more would you be willing to pay for this and this and this? Then you could build that into your data.
You could. The
It'd be
issue
less
with that,
accurate.
yeah, the issue with that is, for example, the example I showed you about the business jet. Those people, that company probably did do a survey, and when they do a survey and you believe what people say, you might be led astray because people say they're going to buy it and then they don't end up buying it. So back to your question about how the regular person could use this. So this is the S&P 500. This is from the second day of February in 2023. And so what we can do here is we can figure out what the price of a share might be here. So in this case, we have a pre-canned equation here that shows that the value of a stock is a function of the book value per share, the number of shares, return on assets, and return on equity. But you see the statistics on this aren't very good, so we might try to predict, say, the cap of a market. And so this is a much better equation. The Pearson's on this is 82%. So we're figuring out the cap based on the outstanding shares, the book value per share, the return on assets, and the return on equity. And so what that looks like then is we can switch any variable here to any other variable. And we might want to take this down to, take that down to this. 0. And return on assets, make that, and make this cap M. And this is book value per share. Take that down to 40. And return that. So now we've got this tool that's, so again, any variable here can be switched for any other. So now I'm trying to predict the market cap based on shares, return on assets, book value per share. And I get a pretty solid demand curve. What we do then typically with this is we go to the model tab and we view the full regression results of an effort here. So what we've got then is we get a series of outputs that show the predicted value versus the actual value. And we take that out to Excel, and then we might rank order this stuff and see which stocks are undervalued. And that's how we pick our stocks in our company here. That's how we do it there.
Who is your typical customer for this software or service?
Well, to date, it's been some very large firms, but we actually have done this for the restaurant down the street. To give you a short example of that, there's a restaurant in town called Oji's that we've gone to several times. And during COVID, they had only the ability to serve outdoors. Because they only could serve outdoors, their seating was limited. And so we went there one day and we had a hard time getting a seat. Because of that, I did some analysis. So what they had over here is they had this configuration A, in which they had 4 tables of 6 and 2 tables of 4. But I know from going into the restaurant frequently that they have more parties of 2, 1 and 2, than they had of other people. So I suggested they put in several tables of 2. They did this. I would have probably suggested even more tables of 2. And it turns out that they ended up increasing their revenue by 25% in 2 months. So that should answer your question, Jerry. That's what you do for a small business is, and it turns out that in the United States, the average restaurant party size, well, the biggest party size is 1, then followed by 2 and 3 and 4. But there's 2.25 times as many parties of 2 as parties of 4. And so that means that you should try to accommodate, if you're the normal kind of restaurant, you should accommodate them in that way. And that lets you have more revenue. In this case, they went up 25% in 2 months. So you can use it for regular things like that. So Neil's asking that the human demand is the real driver and the ultimate problem is driven by technology at the time. Yes, Neil. And in fact, we would, people try to change the technology to meet that demand. So the demand for a cell phone, again, would have been a function of people trying to accommodate the need for real-time communication wherever you are, as demonstrated most vividly, I think, in World War II. The walkie-talkie was a tremendously important communication device. And so people saw how that important it was there. And then they thought, by extension, how valuable would it be in the greater community? And then you can model that from the walkie-talkie all the way up to a cell phone, and then going through the car phones in between them. And that would have modeled that pretty well. Are there any more questions? Do we have to wrap up here?
Okay. Final question, and then, we'll probably, as a courtesy to let people go, what does an organization do if they find out that their product is overpriced?
Oh, another great question there, Gary. Appreciate that. Well, you saw what that demand curve does. And if you're overpriced, you're going to probably find that if you drop your price, you'll sell more. Just yesterday, we went to the theater, or no, Sunday we went to the theater. They had National Cinema Day, and they dropped the price to $4. And they had, in our theater, they had 10 times what they usually have for people there. So it may be the case that cinemas would benefit. They're maybe typically overpriced. If they were to drop their price, they would make more money. And they need to try to test the pricing and the demand curve by raising and lowering prices and see what happens to demand. So good question.
I think from my college textbook, the term was price elasticity. Is that?
Yeah, that's a little long-winded. We like to use slope. Never use 5 syllables when 1 syllable will do, right?
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much, Doug. I was
Thank you.
Amazed at the power of that software. And of course, one needs to have a bit of a statistics and data science background. When I give lectures and I say, because I worked for SAS for 16 years, the big 800-pound gorilla, I always say to people, well, data science, regression, correlation, clustering, association. People say, oh, golly, I took those courses in college, just wanted a passing grade and get out of there. And I warned them, I said, well, sorry, it's here. But the good news is you don't have to go to your attic or basement and dig out your own college textbook, but you do need skill sets in an organization that have those capabilities. So, I'm going to throw it back to Jerry. If you want to just do a closing remark, and I don't have the dates. I'm going to be on vacation for the future webinars.
Yep. So I just want to say thanks to everybody for attending. Special thanks to Doug for presenting and Gary for hosting. If you need to reach out to Doug or would like to join or reach out to the Society of Cost Engineers, feel free to reach out to me. My email is gcollins, so it's GCOLLINS @ societyofcostengineers.com. Thanks again, everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you.